Mira Colt was the kind of person nobody really noticed until she wasn't there anymore. She was not loud. She was not the type to walk into a room and turn heads. She was the one who showed up early, fixed things quietly, and left before anyone thought to say thank you. In her pack, people like her were called Omegas. It was not an insult exactly, but it was not a compliment either. It just meant you were born without rank, without land, without a name that made people sit up straighter when they heard it. She grew up in a small house near the eastern fence of the pack territory, raised by her grandmother after her parents died in a border skirmish when she was 6. Her grandmother taught her 2 things that stuck with her for the rest of her life. First, work hard enough and people forget to ask what rank you were born into. Second, never wait for someone to save you, because most people are too busy saving themselves. By the time she was 23, Mira had become someone the pack quietly depended on without giving her much credit for it. She managed the food stores during the hard winters. She patched up the training yard fences after storms. She kept the water lines running when the old pipes cracked in the cold. Nobody threw a party for her when she did these things. She just did them, and the pack kept functioning, and life moved on. That was where Declan Voss came in. Declan was a beta, second only to the alpha and his closest advisors in rank. He was tall, confident, the kind of man who filled a room with his voice before he even said anything important. He noticed Mira one autumn evening when she was hauling firewood back from the tree line, sleeves rolled up, hair falling out of its tie. He offered to help her carry the wood. She said she didn't need help. He carried it anyway. That was how it started. Small moments like that, over and over, until one day she realized she was smiling every time she saw him walking toward her. He was good at making a person feel like the only one in the room. He remembered small details about her life, the fact that she liked her tea without sugar, the fact that she got quiet on the anniversary of her parents' deaths. He showed up outside her house with a borrowed truck one weekend and drove her out to the ridge just to watch the sunset. He told her she was different from the other girls in the pack, that she had something real in her, something the others didn't have. For 2 months, Mira let herself believe that maybe rank didn't matter as much as people said it did. Maybe love found its way around things like family lines and blood status. Maybe a beta and an omega really could build something together. She should have known better. Her grandmother had warned her, gently but clearly, more than once. "Wolves like him don't fall for people like us," she said one night while they shelled beans on the porch. "They fall for the idea of us for a while. Then the pack starts asking questions, and the idea gets inconvenient." Mira didn't want to hear it. She was in love, or she thought she was, and love felt like it should be stronger than gossip and bloodlines. Then the winter gathering came. The winter gathering was the biggest event in the pack calendar, the night when every family came together around the big fire pit behind the main hall, sharing food, telling stories, and formally announcing bonds, promotions, and matches for the coming year. It was also, Mira would later realize, the night the pack did its yearly accounting of who mattered and who didn't. That year, the pack council had just finished a new census, checking bloodlines and family records to update the official pack ledger. Word got around fast that Mira's file had come back marked plainly, Omega, no title, no land holdings, no notable bloodline. It was information that had always been true. It just hadn't been written down and passed around in ink before. Declan had been standing near the fire with a group of other betas when someone brought up the census results as a joke, laughing about which families were moving up and which ones weren't. Someone mentioned Mira's name. Someone else laughed and asked Declan if he was really serious about the water girl, using the nickname some of the crueler pack members had given her because of the years she spent fixing the water lines. Mira was standing close enough to hear all of it. She watched Declan's face carefully, waiting for him to defend her, to say something, anything, that showed the 2 months they'd spent together meant something real to him. Instead, he laughed along with them. She should have walked away right then. She didn't. She stayed, holding her plate of food, because some small, stubborn part of her still believed he would catch himself, that he would turn around and prove the last 2 months hadn't been a mistake. He turned around, but not the way she hoped. "Look," he said, loud enough for the group near him to hear, loud enough that it carried further than he probably meant it to, or maybe exactly as far as he meant it to. "I need someone with a name attached to her, someone who brings something to the table, not someone who fixes water pipes and hands out stew at the fire pit." For a moment nobody laughed. Then someone did. A short, awkward laugh that broke the silence, and after that the laughter spread the way it does when people are relieved to have permission to be cruel. Mira stood there holding her plate, feeling her face go hot, and then strangely cold. She didn't cry. She had promised herself a long time ago that she would never cry in front of people who wanted to see her break. She set the plate down carefully on the log beside her, the way you set something down when you don't trust your hands not to shake, and she walked away from the fire, out past the edge of the light, into the dark. Nobody followed her. Nobody ever followed the Omegas. That was sort of the whole point of being an Omega, she thought bitterly as she walked. You were the person everyone relied on, and nobody chased after. She didn't go home that night. She kept walking until she reached the old equipment shed near the eastern checkpoint, the one nobody used anymore because it was too far from the main hall and too close to the border. She sat on the cold concrete floor with her knees pulled up to her chest and let herself finally feel everything she'd been holding back at the fire pit. Not tears exactly, something colder and steadier than tears, something that felt a lot like deciding. By morning, she had made up her mind. She wasn't going to go back to the pack hall and pretend nothing happened. She wasn't going to sit through the sympathetic looks and the whispered gossip. She packed a bag with what little she had, walked to the pack council office, and requested a transfer to the border checkpoint duty, the assignment nobody else wanted because it meant weeks alone in rough conditions with almost no support. The council clerk, an older wolf named Old Bram who had known her grandmother, looked at her over his glasses for a long moment before he stamped the papers. "You sure about this, girl?" he asked. "Checkpoint 7 has been a mess for years. Last 3 wolves we sent out there quit within a month." "I'm sure," Mira said. Old Bram studied her face, saw something there that made him decide not to argue further, and slid the paperwork across the desk. "Don't die out there," he said. It was the closest thing to kindness anyone had offered her in days, and she held on to it the whole walk to the checkpoint. Checkpoint 7 sat at the far edge of pack territory, near the base of the Ashford Ridge, a stretch of rocky, uneven land that the pack had never bothered to properly map or maintain. The supply road leading to it had washed out 2 winters ago and never been repaired. The checkpoint building itself was a small stone structure with a leaking roof and a fireplace that hadn't been cleaned in years. Most wolves sent there treated it as a punishment, something to survive until their rotation ended. Mira treated it as something else entirely. She treated it as a chance to prove, at least to herself, that she was capable of more than fixing water pipes and being laughed at around a fire. She spent her first week just clearing the checkpoint building, fixing the roof with materials she found in the old supply shed, patching the fireplace with clay from the riverbed nearby. She spent her second week walking the checkpoint's full patrol route on foot, since there was no working vehicle, mapping out exactly where the supply road had washed out and where an alternate route might be cut through instead. It was hard, lonely work. There were nights when the wind howled through the cracks in the checkpoint walls and she lay awake wondering if anyone back at the pack hall even remembered she existed. There were mornings when her hands were so raw from clearing rocks and cutting brush that she could barely hold a cup of tea. But there was something clean about the loneliness too. Nobody was there to call her the water girl. Nobody was there to laugh when she walked by. It was just her, the ridge, and the work in front of her, and slowly, day by day, she started to feel like herself again. By the middle of her 3rd week, she had done something that surprised even her. Using an old set of survey tools she found in the checkpoint shed, and knowledge she'd picked up from years of helping with pack infrastructure, she mapped out a new supply route through the Ashford Ridge, one that avoided the washed-out road entirely and cut nearly 2 hours off the normal travel time between the checkpoint and the main pack hall. She marked the new route with stone piles and cut brush markers, then wrote up a full report and sent it back to the council with her weekly requisition forms. She didn't expect anyone to notice. She just wanted the record to show she'd done real work out there, work that mattered, work nobody could laugh away. Back at the pack hall, though, something else was happening. Declan had spent the weeks since the winter gathering telling his own version of events, over and over, at the tavern, at training sessions, at his sister's wedding preparations, anywhere people would listen. In his version, Mira had been the one who couldn't handle Abeda's attention, who had gotten too clingy, too serious too fast, and he had done the responsible thing by cutting it off before it became a real problem. He never mentioned the fire pit, or what he'd actually said, or the way she'd walked out into the dark alone. The story worked, mostly, because most people hadn't been standing close enough at the fire to hear the real words. Declan told his version with enough confidence, enough charm, that people believed it without asking too many questions. That was one of his real talents. Mira used to think back when she still liked him. He could make almost anything sound true if he said it with the right amount of certainty. But not everyone believed him. A young Omega named Ren, who had been standing close enough to the fire pit that night to hear every word Declan actually said, made a point of correcting the story whenever she heard it repeated. She wasn't as brave as she wished she could be, and she never argued with Declan directly, but she quietly told the truth to anyone who would listen, especially the other Omegas who worked alongside Mira in the pack's day-to-day operations. He humiliated her, Ren told anyone who asked, in front of everybody. And then she just walked off into the dark, and nobody went after her, and now he's out here acting like she's the one who couldn't handle things. Slowly, in the quiet way that truth sometimes moves through a community, even when the louder story is getting all the attention, people started to wonder about the real version of events. Nobody said anything to Declan directly, but there were looks, small hesitations, a few less laughs the next time he told his version of the story at the tavern. Meanwhile, up on the ridge, Mira had no idea any of this was happening. She was too busy dealing with a different problem entirely. One evening, near the end of her third week at the checkpoint, she found a young pup wandering near the edge of her patrol route, clearly lost, shivering from the cold, too young to have shifted or to explain clearly where he'd come from. She wrapped him in her jacket, gave him what little food she had left, and spent half the night walking the ridge trying to find any sign of a family or a camp nearby. She eventually found tracks leading to a small group of travelers, wolves from a neighboring territory, who had been passing through and lost track of the pup during a river crossing earlier that day. The family was frantic with worry by the time Mira found them, and when she handed the pup back safely, the mother of the group hugged her so tightly Mira nearly lost her balance. "You didn't have to search all night for him," the woman said, wiping tears from her face. "Most checkpoint guards would have just reported it up the chain and let someone else deal with it. I wasn't going to leave a lost kid out there in the cold," Mira said simply. "That's not something you wait on." The traveling family stayed one more night at the checkpoint as guests, and before they left the next morning, the leader of the group, an older wolf with graying fur and sharp eyes, thanked Mira properly and told her something that stuck with her for a long time. "You've got the kind of heart that runs pack territories," he said, "not the kind that just sits at the head of the table, the kind that actually holds everything together while everyone else takes the credit." Mira didn't know what to say to that, so she just nodded and wished them safe travels. But she thought about his words often in the days that followed, turning them over in her mind while she worked, wondering if maybe there was some truth in them after all. By the start of her fourth week, word of Mira's work at Checkpoint 7 had started reaching the Pack Council through her weekly reports and requisition forms. Old Bram, the clerk who had processed her transfer, made a point of bringing her supply route report directly to the council chamber instead of just filing it away like usual paperwork. "You should see what this girl's done out there," he told the council members. 4 days. She mapped a whole new supply route through the Ashford Ridge that our own surveyors couldn't manage in 2 years. Most of the council members barely looked up from their other business. Checkpoint 7 wasn't exactly a priority for most of them. But one of the younger council aides made a note of it anyway, mostly out of curiosity, and filed a copy of Mira's report into the general pack records. None of them knew yet that a very important visitor was about to arrive, one whose attention would change everything. The Alpha King's visits were never announced ahead of time. Cade Thorne ruled over 4 territories, more land and more wolves than any single pack leader in living memory. And kings who held that kind of power didn't need to send warning letters before they showed up somewhere. When he traveled with 2 guards, minimal fanfare, and an expectation that whatever needed to be ready for him would simply be ready, because that was how things worked when you were the most powerful wolf in the region. He arrived at Mira's home pack on a cold afternoon in the 4th week after the winter gathering, unannounced, walking into the main hall while the local alpha and his advisors scrambled to prepare a proper welcome. He waved off the fuss almost immediately. "I'm here for the border reports," he said simply. "Nothing more. Don't make a production of it." The local alpha, a steady but somewhat nervous man named Alpha Garrick, gathered his senior betas quickly to present the pack's border status, hoping to make a good impression on a king who could, with a single word, change the fate of the entire territory if he was displeased. Declan made sure he was the one presenting the checkpoint reports. It was, after all, exactly the kind of moment he'd been waiting for, a chance to stand in front of the most powerful wolf in the region and prove himself worthy of bigger things than being a beta in a mid-sized pack. He'd rehearsed his delivery, practiced his tone, made sure his uniform was pressed, and his boots were clean. He walked the king through most of the border reports smoothly, hitting all the right notes, careful to sound competent without sounding like he was trying too hard. Cade listened with the kind of patient, unreadable expression that made most wolves nervous, flipping through the paperwork in front of him without much reaction. Then he got to checkpoint 7. "And this route change," Cade said, tapping the page in front of him. The map attached to the report was Mira's, the one she'd drawn by hand after weeks of walking the ridge on foot, marking out the new supply path through the Ashford terrain. "Who mapped this?" Declan glanced down at the paperwork, saw the name attached to the report, and gave a small dismissive laugh, the kind of laugh he'd perfected over the years for moments when he wanted to seem relaxed and in control. "That checkpoint's manned by an Omega," he said. "Colt, adequate for what she is." He said it the way people say small, cruel things when they think nobody important is really listening closely. He said, "What she is," like it was obvious, like it needed no further explanation, like everyone in the room would simply understand and move on. Nobody moved on. Cade looked up from the paperwork slowly. The room, which had been full of the low hum of a dozen wolves shuffling papers and murmuring quietly among themselves, went completely silent in the space of about 2 seconds. Alpha Garrick felt his stomach drop, sensing something had shifted in the air, though he couldn't yet say exactly what. "Mira Colt," Cade said. It wasn't a question, it came out flat, certain, like he was confirming something he already knew rather than asking something he didn't. Declan blinked, caught off guard by the reaction, unsure what he'd said wrong. "Yes, that's her." Cade set the paperwork down on the table in front of him with a slow, deliberate motion. "I know that name." The room waited, confused, watching the king's face for some clue about what was happening. Alpha Garrick cleared his throat nervously, trying to smooth over whatever tension had suddenly filled the air. "Is there a problem with the report, my king?" he asked carefully. "No," Cade said. "The report is excellent. Better than excellent." He looked directly at Declan now, and something in his gaze made Declan's confident posture falter slightly for the first time all day. "I want to know where Mira Colt is right now." "At the checkpoint," Declan said, his voice a little less steady than before. "She's been stationed out there for about a month." "Get her back here," Cade said. "Tonight." Nobody in the room fully understood what was happening, but nobody questioned a direct order from the Alpha King either. Within the hour, a rider had been sent out to checkpoint 7 with instructions to bring Mira back to the main pack hall immediately. Mira had no idea what any of this was about. When the rider arrived at the checkpoint, breathless, and slightly confused himself about the urgency of his own orders. All he could tell her was that she was needed back at the main hall right away, on direct instruction from someone very important. She assumed she was in trouble. She spent the entire ride back trying to think of anything she might have done wrong, any report she might have filed incorrectly, any supply request that might have raised questions. By the time she arrived at the pack hall, mud still on her boots from the checkpoint grounds, she had convinced herself she was about to be reprimanded for something. She walked into the main hall, expecting a stern council meeting. Instead, she found the entire hall unusually quiet, most of the senior pack members standing around the edges of the room, and a man she didn't recognize standing near the center, dressed simply but carrying himself with the kind of quiet authority that made the whole room feel smaller around him. She didn't know yet that she was looking at the Alpha King. She just knew, instinctively, that whoever this man was, everyone in the room was very carefully aware of him. "You built a new supply route through the Ashford Ridge," Cade said, before she'd even fully processed where she was. "Alone, in under 4 days, based on the report timestamps." Mira blinked, caught off guard, glancing around the room for some kind of explanation before answering. "It needed doing," she said finally. The old road had washed out. Nobody was going to fix it otherwise. "It needed doing," Cade repeated, and something in his expression shifted slightly, something that might have been the beginning of a smile if his face allowed for such things easily. "Half the surveyors in my own territories couldn't map that kind of terrain accurately without proper equipment and a full team behind them. You did it with hand tools and no support." Mira didn't know how to respond to that. She glanced toward Declan, who was standing near the edge of the room, his earlier confidence completely gone, his face pale and uncertain. For a brief second their eyes met, and she saw something in his expression she never expected to see there. Something like fear. Cade noticed the glance too. He looked between the two of them for a moment, and something clicked into place in his mind, some understanding of the tension in the room that he hadn't had before. "I heard how she was described earlier today," Cade said, turning back to face the room fully now, his voice carrying easily across the silent hall. "Adequate for what she is." Those were the words used. Nobody spoke. Declan seemed to be doing everything in his power to become invisible, but there was nowhere for him to hide in a room this quiet. Cade crossed the distance between himself and Mira slowly, deliberately, and every wolf in that hall watched the space between them shrink with a kind of stunned disbelief. Kings did not simply walk toward Omegas. Kings barely acknowledged Omegas existed, most of the time, beyond their basic function within a pack's daily operations. This was not how things were supposed to go. "I don't claim easily," Cade said, once he was close enough that only Mira and the wolves nearest the center of the room could hear him clearly. "I have turned down mates from families with kingdoms behind them. Families that could have doubled my territory overnight. I've never once regretted turning any of them down, because none of them ever showed me the kind of work I just read about in that report." Mira's heart was pounding so hard, she was sure everyone in the room could hear it. "I don't understand what's happening right now," she said honestly, because it was the only true thing she could think to say. "I'm asking your permission," Cade said, and his voice softened just slightly, enough that it no longer felt like a king addressing a room, but more like a person speaking directly to another person. "Before anything else happens here, I want you to understand that. I'm not here to claim you the way that man over there apparently thought he could discard you. I'm asking, in front of everyone who watched you get humiliated a month ago, whether you would allow me to claim you as my mate." The room, if it was possible, went even quieter than before. Mira looked at him for a long moment, searching his face for some sign that this was some kind of elaborate joke, some test, some trick designed to hurt her further. She found nothing like that there. She found instead something steady, something certain, something that reminded her a little of the way she felt when she finished mapping that supply route through the ridge, tired and proud and finally, seen. "Why me?" she asked quietly. "You don't know me. You read one report." "I know enough," Cade said. "I know you spent 4 days doing work, most people would need weeks and a full team to accomplish. I know you did it alone, without complaint, without asking for recognition. I know that when I asked who you were, the man standing across this room called you adequate, and I know that word is the single biggest insult I have ever heard applied to someone who clearly deserves far more than that. I don't need to know everything about you tonight to know you're worth more than the way you were treated in this pack. Mira felt something break loose in her chest, something she'd been holding tightly closed since the night of the winter gathering. She thought about the fire pit, the laughter, the plate she'd set down so carefully because she didn't trust her hands. She thought about the walk into the dark, alone, with nobody following. She thought about the weeks at the checkpoint, proving to herself, and apparently now to a king as well, that she was more than what people said about her. "Yes," she said, and her voice came out steadier than she expected. "You can claim me." Cade reached for her hand, slowly, giving her every opportunity to pull away if she changed her mind. She didn't. She placed her hand in his, and the entire hall watched as the Alpha King of 4 territories bent his head toward an Omega, who, 1 month earlier, had been publicly rejected and mocked in front of the very same crowd now watching in stunned silence. The claim itself happened quickly, the way these things do, a moment of heat and connection that left Mira breathless and the mark at her throat burning warm. When it was done, Cade straightened and turned to face the room, his arms settling protectively around her. "Mira Colt is now under my protection, and she carries my mark," he said, his voice carrying easily across the hall, loud enough that nobody could pretend later they hadn't heard it clearly. "Any pack, any wolf, anyone anywhere in the 4 territories who treats her as less than she deserves will answer directly to me. I don't care what her birth records say about her rank. From this night forward, her rank is decided by the mark she carries, and that mark belongs to the highest seat in this region." Declan stood frozen near the edge of the room, his face pale, his earlier confidence completely gone. He opened his mouth once, like he might try to say something, though what exactly he thought he could say in that moment was hard to guess. Nothing came out. He closed his mouth again and looked down at the floor. Cade noticed the movement and turned toward him, his expression cooling considerably. "You have something to add?" "No," Declan said quietly. "Nothing, my king." "Good," Cade said, "because I think you've said quite enough already tonight." The hall remained quiet for a long moment after that, nobody quite sure what to do with themselves, until Alpha Garrick, ever the diplomat, cleared his throat and began organizing a formal reception for the newly claimed pair, mostly out of habit and a desperate need to give the stunned pack members something to do with themselves. Word of what happened that night spread through the pack faster than any story Declan had ever told at the tavern. Within a week, it had traveled to neighboring territories as well, the story of the Omega who'd been publicly humiliated by a Beta and then claimed by the Alpha King himself in front of the very same crowd. People told it in different ways, some focusing on the romance of it, some focusing on the justice of it, but the core of the story stayed the same no matter who was telling it. The girl everyone had overlooked had been seen, finally, by someone whose opinion the whole region had to respect. Declan's reputation, which had been built carefully over years on charm and confidence, crumbled almost overnight. It wasn't that people openly mocked him, at least not to his face, but the respect he'd once commanded simply evaporated. Wolves who used to laugh at his jokes now found reasons to be somewhere else when he approached. Betas, who used to seek his opinion on pack matters, started going around him instead. Within a few months, he requested a transfer to a distant territory, hoping for a fresh start somewhere his name didn't carry the weight of that winter gathering story. Ren, the young Omega who had quietly told the truth about what really happened that night at the fire pit, found herself unexpectedly respected within the pack for having stood by the truth even when it wasn't the popular version of events. Mira never forgot her loyalty, and in the years that followed, she made sure Ren had opportunities and support that the old pack hierarchy would never have given an Omega on its own. As for Mira herself, Life changed in ways she was still adjusting to months later. She moved from the small house near the eastern fence to Cade's main territory, a place with more land and more responsibility than she'd ever imagined for herself. She didn't slip easily into the role of a king's mate, not at first. She still woke up some mornings expecting to have to fix a water pipe or clear brush from a border trail, old habits that didn't disappear just because her circumstances had changed so dramatically. Cade never asked her to become someone different than who she already was. If anything, he seemed to actively resist any attempt by his advisors to smooth her rough edges into something more traditionally suited for a king's mate. When one of his senior council members suggested she might benefit from lessons in formal etiquette, Cade politely declined on her behalf. She built a functioning supply route through impossible terrain with her bare hands and no support, he told the council member. I don't think she needs lessons in which fork to use. Mira eventually found her own place within Cade's territories, not by pretending to be someone she wasn't, but by doing the same kind of quiet, practical work she'd always done, just on a much larger scale. She took on responsibility for infrastructure projects across the 4 territories, applying the same hands-on approach that had gotten her noticed in the first place. Border checkpoints that had been neglected for years suddenly found themselves properly staffed and maintained. Supply routes that nobody had bothered updating in decades got surveyed and improved. She earned respect, not because of the mark she carried, but because of the work she continued to do, the same work she'd always done, the work nobody used to notice or thank her for. A year after that winter gathering, Mira found herself back at her old pack for a formal visit, standing near the same fire pit where everything had fallen apart, and then come back together in ways she never could have predicted. She watched the flames for a long moment, thinking about the girl who had set her plate down so carefully on that log, who had walked into the dark alone because nobody thought she was worth following. You're thinking about that night, Cade said, coming to stand beside her, his voice quiet enough that it stayed between just the two of them. I am, Mira admitted. It doesn't feel real sometimes. How different everything turned out to be. It's real, Cade said. You made it real. I just happened to be paying attention when it mattered. Mira smiled, the kind of smile that came easily now in a way it hadn't for a long time before that winter. She thought about her grandmother, about the 2 lessons that had shaped so much of how she moved through the world. Work hard enough and people forget to ask what rank you were born into. Never wait for someone to save you, because most people are too busy saving themselves. Both lessons had turned out to be true, in their own way. She had worked hard, and eventually people did stop caring about her rank, because the work spoke louder than any old census record ever could. And she hadn't waited to be saved either. She had walked away from that fire pit on her own, gone to the checkpoint on her own, built a new route through impossible terrain on her own. Cade hadn't rescued her from anything. He had simply arrived at exactly the moment her own hard work finally got the recognition it always deserved, and he'd had the sense to see clearly what was standing right in front of him. The fire crackled between them, the same kind of fire that had once witnessed her worst night, now witnessing something entirely different. Somewhere in the crowd gathered for the visit, she caught sight of Wren, laughing easily with a group of other pack members, no longer quite so quiet or overlooked herself these days. Old Bram stood near the food tables, watching the scene with the same knowing expression he'd worn the day he stamped her transfer papers. Mira reached for Cade's hand, and this time there was no crowd holding its breath, no stunned silence, just 2 people standing near a fire, comfortable in a life neither of them had expected to find, but both of them had chosen fully once they found it. Somewhere far off in another territory, Declan Voss was still telling stories at whatever new tavern he'd found himself in, though these days, if the story of the winter gathering ever came up, he made sure to change the subject quickly. Some stories, once the truth catches up to them, are better left in the past. And some people, the ones who spend years being underestimated and overlooked, end up writing the kind of ending nobody saw coming, least of all the people who never bothered to look closely enough in the first place. That was the whole story, really. Not a fairy tale about a poor girl saved by a king, but a story about someone who kept showing up for herself long before anyone else thought she was worth showing up for. The king's claim was just the moment the rest of the world finally caught up to what she already knew about her own worth.